At an international airport, Ebony Grant, a confident black woman, faced humiliating treatment by officers unaware she owned the airline they served. What followed exposed systemic racism and sparked a global reckoning. What happened next will shock you. But let's start from the beginning. The hum of the bustling airport was a symphony of announcements, hurried footsteps, and distant conversations. Ebony Grant stood composed amid the chaos, her tailored black pantsuit hugging her figure with an air of effortless authority. At 42, her presence alone turned heads. Her short, neatly cropped hair framed a face that radiated both confidence and an unflinching resolve. In her hands, she clutched a sleek leather handbag, its minimalist elegance a quiet declaration of her stature. As the line at the security checkpoint inched forward, Ebony handed over her passport with a polite but distant smile. The officer barely glanced at her before motioning to the next step. The conveyor belt swallowed her designer carry-on as she stepped through the body scanner. But before she could collect her belongings, the lead officer barked out, "Ma'am, step aside for a full-body search." Ebony's sharp eyebrow arched. She didn't speak, instead taking a measured breath before stepping into the designated area. The officer, a broad-shouldered man with a gruff demeanor and an air of self-importance, gestured impatiently. Behind her, passengers shifted uncomfortably in line, some exchanging curious glances, others averting their eyes entirely. As Ebony stood still, her arms outstretched, a younger officer fumbled with her passport. It slipped from his grip, fluttering to the floor. Picking it up hastily, he read the name aloud with a mocking edge. "Ebony Grant," he said, his tone dripping with misplaced superiority. A smirk followed. "Sounds fancy." The lead officer chuckled, his eyes scanning Ebony with a mixture of suspicion and condescension. The whispering between the two didn't go unnoticed. Ebony's expression didn't waver, though a flicker of annoyance crossed her sharp features. She was used to this. The scrutiny, the thinly veiled hostility, and the unwarranted invasiveness. It was an all-too-familiar pattern for a black woman of her caliber. But what these officers failed to realize was that Ebony Grant was far from ordinary. Atlantic Air's corporate structures were complex, but there was one undeniable truth. Ebony owned more of it than anyone else. As the largest shareholder of the very airline dominating the terminal's traffic, her wealth wasn't just extraordinary, it was transformative. She had built her empire from the ground up, and no amount of prejudice could diminish her achievements. The search was invasive, with the officer brushing too close, his actions just towing the line of impropriety. Passengers behind the glass partition watched uneasily, some pulling out their phones, unsure whether to intervene or document. Ebony met their gazes briefly, her eyes calm but unyielding. "Ma'am, for safety reasons, we'll need to check your belongings again," the lead officer announced, his tone clipped. It wasn't a request. At that moment, Ebony spoke for the first time. Her voice was smooth, but laced with steel. "I trust there's a valid reason for this additional check?" The officer faltered, caught off guard by her quiet confidence. Her words hung in the air as the room's dynamics shifted. Ebony wasn't just another passenger. They were about to learn exactly who they were dealing with. The air in the security checkpoint grew heavy, tension rippling through the space like an unseen wave. Passengers shifted uneasily, their hushed murmurs betraying their discomfort as Ebony Grant endured an escalating invasion of her privacy. The lead officer, his bulk towering and his demeanor insufferable, made no attempt to mask the unnecessary zeal of his actions. The frisking, which had already crossed into unwarranted territory, pushed even further as his hands lingered and prodded with blatant disregard. Ebony stood tall, her sharp features betraying no emotion, beyond a quiet, simmering resolve. But when his hands brushed too close to what was clearly unnecessary, she broke her silence. Her voice, rich and commanding, sliced through the murmurs like a scalpel. Is there a specific concern with my profile, or is this simply an exercise in theatrics? Her words froze the officer mid-movement, his smirk briefly faltering. Recovering quickly, he scoffed, his bravado a thin veneer over his unease. Ma'am, we're ensuring safety for all passengers. You fit the description. The audacity of his response made the onlookers bristle. The room's energy shifted as a few passengers murmured their disapproval more audibly. A mother clutching her child frowned deeply, while a young man holding his phone hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or document. Even so, the officer pressed on, his arrogance unchecked. Unbeknownst to him, an older white man in a crisp business suit, standing a few feet away, had recognized Ebony. His face turned ashen as realization struck. This wasn't just a random traveler being subjected to an overreach of authority. This was Ebony Grant, the woman whose name was synonymous with power in the aviation industry, the largest shareholder of Atlantic Air. Hastily, the man pulled out his phone, fumbling as he began making a call. His frantic gestures betrayed his panic as he turned away, trying to remain inconspicuous. Ebony noticed. She noticed everything. The passenger's discomfort, the businessman's retreat, and most importantly, the officer's growing smugness as he pulled out a metal-detecting wand. With a smirk, he waved it in her direction. "Let's make sure nothing's hidden," he sneered, relishing his perceived authority. That was the final straw. Ebony's hand moved imperceptibly, her shoulders straightening as if to anchor her next words. Her tone was calm, yet it carried the weight of a warning, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "I'll give you one more chance to reconsider your actions." The lead officer paused, blinking as if momentarily stunned by her confidence. The room fell into a deafening silence, the murmurs and movement ceasing entirely. Every eye was on Ebony, her presence commanding the space effortlessly. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the officer's face. It was a momentary crack in his bravado, but Ebony caught it and pressed the advantage without needing to say another word. She didn't have to. The power in her stance spoke volumes. It was a warning that he would regret ignoring. Within minutes, the air at the security checkpoint became charged with chaos. The older man who had earlier recognized Ebony Grant returned, his business suit now slightly rumpled as though hastily donned. His face, pale and tight with unease, betrayed the urgency of his mission. Flanked by a small entourage of airline staff, he cut through the line with quick strides, his every movement brimming with the weight of the situation. "Ms. Grant," he stammered, his voice a mix of apology and desperation as he reached her. He paused to catch his breath, his gaze darting toward the officers as if daring them to speak. "I sincerely apologize for this oversight." He gestured broadly toward the lead officer, whose smug expression had shifted to one of wary confusion. "These officers," the man continued, his voice sharper now, "are clearly misinformed." The lead officer frowned, his earlier confidence now replaced with visible uncertainty. "Wait, who exactly is she?" he asked, his tone still laced with authority, but now carrying a slight tremor. The question hung in the air, but the older man didn't acknowledge it. His focus remained squarely on Ebony, his posture deferential, almost pleading. "On behalf of Atlantic Air," the manager said, inclining his head slightly, "I assure you, this will be addressed immediately. This does not reflect our standards." Ebony raised her hand slightly, silencing him with the smallest of gestures. Her smirk was subtle but unmistakable, her posture as poised as ever. Stepping forward, she closed the gap between herself and the now flustered manager, her every move deliberate. "No need to clean up now," she said, her voice cool and steady, carrying across the checkpoint with ease. "Your policies speak for themselves." The gathered passengers, now a sizable crowd, watched with rapt attention. A few pulled out their phones, capturing the unfolding drama. Ebony turned slowly, her eyes sweeping the room, catching the gaze of as many onlookers as she could. Her voice, calm yet commanding, rose above the whispers. "This," she said, gesturing toward the officers, the checkpoint, and the ongoing scene, "is how they treat black women, until they realize we own the skies they serve." A hush fell over the crowd as her words hung in the air, heavy with truth and undeniable power. The lead officer's face turned an alarming shade of red, whether from embarrassment, anger, or both. It was hard to say. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, no longer whispers of curiosity, but outright discontent. The manager shifted uncomfortably, his efforts to salvage the situation clearly unraveling. Ebony took one last, deliberate look at the checkpoint, her smirk never faltering. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps measured and purposeful, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. The aftermath of the incident was swift and far-reaching. Within hours, videos from the airport began circulating online. Fellow passengers, some of whom had initially hesitated to intervene, had recorded the entire ordeal. The shaky footage captured the invasive frisking, the officers' smirks, Ebony Grant's unyielding composure, and her biting declaration. "This is how they treat black women, until they realize we own the skies they serve." The videos spread like wildfire across social media platforms, garnering millions of views in a matter of hours. The comment sections erupted with outrage, solidarity, and pointed critiques of systemic bias. Hashtags like #StandWithEbony and #AirportRacism began trending worldwide. Media outlets picked up the story, broadcasting clips that juxtaposed the officer's treatment of Ebony with her commanding rebuttal and the panicked arrival of the Atlantic Air manager. By the time Ebony's private jet departed the airport, the ripple effects were already in motion. Atlantic Air, faced with mounting public pressure, issued a statement acknowledging the incident. The airline announced that the officers involved were suspended, pending a full investigation. "We are committed to ensuring our services reflect the values of equity, dignity, and respect," the statement read, though many found the apology perfunctory. The company's executives scrambled to contain the fallout, knowing that the reputation of their flagship airline and their shareholder relations hung in the balance. Meanwhile, Ebony was the picture of grace under fire. Settling into the plush interior of her private jet, she took a moment to reflect before reaching for her phone. She drafted a tweet, succinct yet searing, and hit post. "Owning 49% of Atlantic Air doesn't exempt me from racism, but exposing it makes the journey worthwhile. Equity everywhere." Her words landed like a thunderclap. The tweet, shared alongside a clipped video of her confrontation, was retweeted tens of thousands of times within hours. Celebrities, activists, and public figures amplified her message, commending her bravery and drawing attention to the pervasive issue of racial profiling. The story quickly transcended the incident itself, sparking broader conversations about institutional bias, corporate accountability, and systemic inequality. On talk shows, pundits debated whether the airline's response was sufficient. Universities and organizations began using the video in training sessions on implicit bias. Advocacy groups called for reforms in airport security protocols, demanding transparency and oversight to prevent similar incidents. Ebony's calm yet scathing takedown of the officers became emblematic of a larger fight. In interviews, she emphasized that the incident was not about her wealth or power, but about exposing a system that targeted people based on race. "If it can happen to me," she stated during a live panel discussion, "imagine what happens to those without the resources to fight back." As the weeks passed, the story showed no signs of fading. Airlines worldwide reevaluated their security practices, and social media platforms continued to amplify the voices of those sharing similar experiences. What began as an act of unwarranted scrutiny turned into a global reckoning, proving that even in the face of injustice, a single voice, steady and fearless, could ignite a movement.